a couple airplanes, the CFA-18, okay, the Su-27, and the F-15, three incredibly outstanding airplanes. The Su-27 held 27 world records for combat airplanes. It had the longest range of any fighter. I think it was like 2,700-mile range in ferry mode. That's pretty far. Now, with air-to-air refueling, is that really the most important? Well, it is and it isn't, because if your air tanker only has to fly, if your air tanker has to be in the air all day, that's pretty costly. So if your fighter can go fly for 5 hours before the air tanker has to meet up with them and take off, you could actually save money by having a much longer range airplane. The F-15 is definitely faster. Who climbed faster, the Su-27 or the F-15? Well, the Su-27 at one point could outclimb it could climb 8 or 9 miles a minute, okay? And then eventually 10 miles a minute. That's pretty fast. That's Mach 1. That's going vertical at Mach 1. Now, mind you, that's at air show weight, but in actual reality, like, it climbed about 8 or 9 miles a minute. The F-4 Phantom climbed about 8 or 9 miles a minute. It was an outstanding amount of climb rate. The F-18, at full combat weight, I think is about 2 miles a minute. That's still pretty darn good. Going back to the Messerschmitt Comet, just to kind of recap on some of the older technology of World War II, the Messerschmitt Comet climbed at 3 miles a minute. That was the rocket-powered interceptor, okay? That's phenomenal even by today's standards, okay? So you got the F-18 with a full combat load, maybe not a full max combat load, but a combat load is about 2 miles a minute. That's still pretty good. And about 5 miles a minute, without. Maybe 6 or 7 miles a minute for the CF-18 version, because we've bumped up the engines to 26,000 pounds thrust versus its original 12. And then I think the Americans are probably into the 18 or the 20 pound, 21,000 pounds of thrust. We keep updating, like with the Canada, we just keep, okay, let's tweak it more, but it's a small airplane. We can only tweak it so much. The same as we tweaked that from its original variant to diving to Mach 1 and stuff like that. The engine's almost doubled in power by the end of its service in 1986. From the 1950s to the 1986, that thing almost doubled in power, but it didn't. It was limited. The airframe limited it. You couldn't get it You could get it to climb a little faster, but you couldn't get it to. You could only teach an old dog so many tricks, right? F-15, well, that thing will climb 10 miles a minute, easy, in air show mode. In combat mode, most of these things will climb about half. Okay, people will banter back and forth all day about what it could do. Now let's talk about what the Arrow did. Now, okay, one more, the F-35, because that is the main airplane that Canada's supposed to get. We committed to that on politics, not on... no practical, sane person would sign on to that program. you know what I mean? That was a make-work program. It'll never be fully delivered. It's going to fail because it's too big to fail. Well, how many times have these too big to fails failed? Of course it's going to fail. You need to pay to specialize. Now, here's the thing. On the third flight, this thing went Mach 1.1. Not that big of a deal. Okay. Eventually, the quickest it would go on record was Mach 1.9, just about the Mach 2. Okay. And also on the third flight, okay, it made it to 49,000 feet. Okay, so that's not, that's a little under. It made it to 50,000 feet, an awful lot, because they tested it at 50,000 feet. They also tested the cruise at 36,000 feet. To see where it would cruise the best, best fuel economy, that type of thing. Then, one thing it had to accomplish in the day, and again, this professor is just, he didn't look at this stuff, obviously, because, at the time, for an airplane to make a turn at 50,000 feet without losing speed or altitude was next to an impossibility. There wasn't a lot of airplanes that could do that. This did it and exceeded that. It had to be able to pull 2 Gs, sustained, at 50,000 feet. You have to understand, at 50,000 feet, there's like no oxygen up there. There's, the air is pretty thin up there. Hence, this thing had a lot of wing area. Okay? It was able to do that, and it exceeded that. Now, to today's standard, every airplane can do that. That's no problem. So, 50,000 feet, turning at a 2G turn at Mach 1.4, Mach 1.5, that's pretty damn impressive. Even to today's standards. There's a lot of airplanes that can't do that. Well, look at the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15. They got up past 36,000 feet. The airplane started to they didn't have enough wing area or power. The engines could get up there to 50,000 feet, but they would stall out if they started doing any hard turning. They would stall out. This thing wouldn't. Okay, that's a feat. Okay, but I guess that doesn't matter if you're a professor of Toronto, right? I'm not picking on all professors of Toronto, but you got to call a douchebag, right? I mean, this thing was a huge success. Now, it also did something else, and this happened on the 7th flight. And this is what of all the other numbers I've given you, okay, this thing, okay, with full combat load, apparently could climb about 5 miles a minute. Not so impressive, right? Okay, the Su-27 holds the record at climbing 10 miles a minute, and the F-15 is probably caught up to that by now. That's Mach 1, 650 miles an hour straight up. This thing climbed vertically at 1,000 miles an hour. Think about that. Nearly 14 miles a minute. And they say it's not a feasible airplane to put into production. I'm not saying this thing didn't have bugs and problems. Of course it did. But even on the first flight, they said it was so smooth that when they landed, it didn't even set off the the landing sensor pads. It just how hard does an airplane land, that type of thing. What stress is it putting on it? It didn't even set it off. This thing flew very smoothly. I mean, if you think about it, it's really the shape of a paper airplane. Simple, low tech, works no matter what. It's naturally stable. What was the roll rate? I think about 150 degrees a second was something like the roll rate, and I think the turning radius was 15 degrees. But again, like if you look at the Su-27 and the Su-35, it's 60 degrees of pitch and yaw, but it doesn't mean you can maintain that. This airframe, it probably would be able to maintain it if you could lighten the airplane. Again, take the same airplane, okay, you just throw the CF-18 engines on it, okay, you get a mile to the gallon on the CF-18. The CF-18's internal range is 600 gallons. It gets about 600 mile range, give or take, give or take. This thing, if you put those same engines in it, you then have a 2,900 mile range right away, and when it accomplished that 1,000 miles per minute climb, about Mach 1.5 something, guess what? It had about the same power thrust as the CF-18. So think about that. This thing still has potential. Again, the drawings are there. You get a modern day aerodynamic testing. You really don't have a lot of testing to do. All you really have to do is change the design. And this is where the program, either if they were to ever reinstate it, it's already been shot down. They won't do it unless somebody private sector says, look, we're going to build the airframe. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. And we know that this thing is a competitor. If it has a 2,000 plus mile range, 2,000 miles is not enough because our country is huge. We need an 85-foot long airplane. This is it. This is why it was so big. It needed to do that in the day. Now, the advantage of having such a big airplane is you can put a lot of avionics in there. You can even have multi-nose cones for different missions. Maybe you have a reconnaissance mission, light radar capabilities, huge aerial photography, in-orbit satellite. Maybe you have radar jamming. Like an A6 intruder or a prowler. The sky's the limits here. Look at the radar capabilities of the Su-35. You want to know why it has so much capability? Have you seen the size of the freaking nose on that? It's the size of the truck. The 13-foot nose. That's about the same. You could put a lot of radar capabilities. I mean, the radar itself is about 1,500 pounds, and you know what I mean. That's a lot of capabilities. Any sensors needed for the Arctic? Well, you have 85 feet of aircraft to find places to put sensors. You know what I mean? And you know what? You don't need a computer program to fly this. The airframe has to be as simple as possible to be as low in maintenance as possible. So, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to change it to stealth. We're going to put a V-tail on it. No, that's not what we need to do. The same essential lines. It's not. This thing is not going to be that stealthy. You can square it up a bit and get it stealthy-ish. Kind of the same way the Super Hornet's kind of stealthy-ish, but it's not a stealth airplane. That's kind of the idea what you're going to do with this. You're really not going to change the design that much. What you're going to change is the engine. Considering the size, it's like a 48. There's 4 foot right there. That's 4 feet of the engine nacelle. Okay. There's not too many airplane interceptors now that have that much. I mean, you have the amount of engine you can put in there for the given space in there is just phenomenal. So with the new engine technology, not only can you put in extremely lighter engines, okay, to take down the weight of the airplane. If you can get this airplane under 30,000 pounds, holy crap, it would have probably about a 5,000 mile range, reach Mach 3, no problem. and you'd probably fly circles around a Mirage 2000, even at that massive size. It can be done. Why? Well, that's what they could accomplish. Again, 14 miles a minute is just incredible. And this thing did, it was able to get up to the 75,000 feet. How effective flight controls you would have at 75,000 feet? Probably you're flying on engine power at that point. But the thing is that you could get up there, do a rollover, and come down on an enemy. And that could be a fighter. Basically, this thing becomes a bird of prey. So I think that guy is wrong. No, the Arrow wasn't perfect, even to today. But to today's standards, there's many airplanes. When you start looking at the numbers of what this thing did accomplish, and it didn't reach all its target goals, but it did reach most of them. Now, the weapons system and stuff like that, again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel to get this thing working. And it'll be, you want to make it as reliable as possible. But a weapons bay, that gives you a clean airframe. That's what gives you the great range, And external hardpoints, well, that's what gives you payload. So you make this thing like a flying tank, but yet still light, like the A-10, so it can take a hit. A massive amount of ammunition, like 25 millimeter cannon with about 2,000 plus rounds of ammo. You got the room to do it. It will carry it. It will carry it. And then pick the weapon you want to put in there. Almost all modern day weapons will fit in those 16-foot bomb bays. Yeah. So was it a success? Yes, it was a success. It still accomplished things that the F-35 can never accomplish. It'll never do VSTOL. It'll never, vertically take off. But do we really need that? If we change the ducting of the engines, we could do like the MiG-29s and take off on a dirt runway. Yeah. And then when you get into the air, you open up the main nacelles. The Harrier does it as well. You can incorporate so much stuff in here that's still low tech, works no matter what. But we need to really, really examine the Arrow design. It was a good airplane. It's not phenomenal. It might need forward canards to be able to get some better maneuverability. But maybe, like the Su-35, there's a variant with canards for more maneuverability. There's also a variant without canards that, that is meant for more quick interception, So the guy's wrong. The Arrow was definitely not a failure. I just think, he might have watched the movie and said, oh, it's just full of BS and stuff like that. Yes, there is a lot of BS in the movie, stuff like that. It didn't make it to the edge of outer space. But when you just look at the flight logs, it'll tell you everything you really need to know about this airplane. It had a few bugs in it. Most of it was landing gear related, the doors closing and opening. That's it. That's stuff that can, with today's technology, we can figure it out how to make it, work quite well. But you just, no matter what airplane it is today, time to climb, this thing is going to be a good interceptor. Now, mind you, climbing 14 miles a minute, that's probably what gave you your 400 mile limited range. But you're not always going to be doing that. Again, with a drop tank, you might have 1,200 on the original variant. Modern day, you've got 2,900 mile range internal fuel. And if you can make better fuel efficiency other than the CF-18, which is about a mile to the gallon, so you get 2 miles a gallon, then it has a 5,000 mile range. Think of that. An airplane built in its own country, all that money stays in the country. The design is already there, we just have to tweak it and refine it, kind of like what we did with the CF-100. And, bubble canopy so it can dogfight. It could also double back as a trainer just because you can make it tandem controls. Plus, it has all those huge advantages. Patrol airplane, interceptor, reconnaissance, attack aircraft, bomber, strike bomber. Again, it's big enough you can do all that. That's the only problem with the CF-18 is it's not big enough. But I would even incorporate some of the stuff from the CF-18 to this. So, anyway, I guess I got to leave it at that. But just go look at the numbers. You'll see what I mean. So, rate, subscribe, and know the Arrow. Definitely post to your social media. No, the Arrow was not a disaster. It was a huge success. If it could be built in 1958, 1959, what can we do in 2013? All right, there we go. Okay, so this guy says it was a failure. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple airplanes. The CF-A-18, okay, the Su-27, and the F-15. 3 incredibly outstanding airplanes. The Su-27 held 27 world records for combat airplanes. It had the longest range of any fighter. I think it was like 2,700 mile range in ferry mode. That's that's pretty far. Now, with air-to-air refueling, is that really the most important? Well, it is and it isn't, because if your air tanker only has to, if your air tanker has to be in the air all day, that's pretty costly. So if your fighter can go fly for 5 hours before the air tanker has to meet up with them and take off, you could actually save money by having a much longer range airplane. The F-15 is definitely faster. Who climbed faster, the Su-27 or the F-15? Well, the Su-27 at one point could outclimb it could climb 8 or 9 miles a minute, okay? And then eventually 10 miles a minute. That's pretty fast. That's Mach 1. That's going vertical at Mach 1. Now, mind you, that's at air show weight, but in actual reality, like, it climbed about 8 or 9 miles a minute. The F-4 Phantom climbed about 8 or 9 miles a minute. It was an outstanding amount of climb rate. The F-18, at full combat weight, I think is about 2 miles a minute. That's still pretty darn good. Going back to the Messerschmitt Comet, just to kind of recap on some of the older technology of World War II, the Messerschmitt Comet climbed at 3 miles a minute. That was the rocket-powered interceptor, okay? That's phenomenal even by today's standards, okay? So you got the F-18 with a full combat load, maybe not a full max combat load, but a combat load is about 2 miles a minute. That's still pretty good. And about 5 miles a minute, without maybe 6 or 7 miles a minute for the CF-18 version, because we've bumped up the engines to 26,000 pounds of thrust versus its original 12. And then I think the Americans are probably into the 18 or the 21,000 pounds of thrust. We keep updating, like with the Canada, we just keep, okay, let's tweak it more, but it's a